Tired of communication blackouts at the worst possible times? To prevent them, you're going to need a reliable relay network. And that's what this and the next 2 episodes are going to be about. But it's still nice to be able to satisfy contracts along the way, and the ideal contract to piggyback off of is the position a satellite in a specific orbit of Kerbin. As such, the focus of this episode will not only be on how to build an effective relay satellite, but also how to move that satellite from some inconvenient orbit about Kerbin to an appropriate orbit about the Moon. Let's get started. Just like with the previous videos in this series, this is a pure stock game. No mods whatsoever, not even the DLCs are installed. And I did lose my save and my install entirely, actually, for the other contract videos that you've seen in this series. So what I have done is restarted the game and then started playing through it to get myself to, well, some sort of a state where I've run into something I've not done before. So I've already done a bunch of contracts. These are all early contracts. Launch our first vessel, orbit Kerbin. I've explored the Moon. This is just the flyby one. I have, conducted some observational surveys of Kerbins, done some tourist contracts, that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of stuff that's all been in previous videos in this series. I don't want to repeat myself, but what I did come across is some of these position a satellite in a specific orbit of Kerbin contracts. So if I take a look at this one here, got to go into a specific orbit of Kerbin. Apoapsis at about 3,600 kilometers, periapsis about 1,500 kilometers, about a 17-degree inclination. I do have videos on how to do that, but what I don't have videos of in this series is how to install relays. I didn't do any relay stuff. So what I want to do is kind of use this contract as an excuse to get something into orbit to satisfy this contract. But then what we'll do is we'll shuffle it over to the Moon. And there it will go into an appropriate orbit for a relay. I'll talk about what that appropriate orbit could be. And we'll install it as one of 3 relays that will eventually go in and around the Moon. And that's going to be part 1. That's going to be this video here. Now, I do have a second position a satellite in a specific orbit of Kerbin, so sort of same thing, different orbit, of course. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to satisfy this contract and then get that relay over to the Moon, and we'll put it into an orbit. And in that second video, we'll talk about, well, how do you shuffle the 2 relays so that they are in appropriate positions? And in fact, we'll put a third one in there as well. How do we take these 3 independent satellites and put them all together into a relay network when they're all launched separately? And then in the third video, well, I've now got my Moon one all finished off. What we'll do is we'll put 3 relays around Minmus, but we'll do that one in one entire launch. So that's going to be these 3 videos, all about relays. So if you want to know about relays, we're going to get you covered. Now, just to sort of show you where I'm at, again, I started a whole career game all over again, but I have accomplished some things. I have upgraded some buildings. I have a Tier 2 astronaut complex, Tier 2 mission control, Tier 2 tracking station, Tier 2 vehicle assembly building, Tier 2 launch pad, and that's it, actually. All the rest of the buildings are Tier 1. If I go into the tech tree, I'm still pretty low in the tech tree. I've completed up to the end of Tier 4, and then in Tier 5, I only got this one node, electrics, and I got that so I can have some of these Oxdat solar panels and a bit of an extra battery, as well as, of course, some other things, including the Octo Probe Core. I wanted to get that as well. You can see I do have some science. I could unlock some more nodes, but I'm not going to, because I'm keeping this kind of minimalistic, so that if you end up in a situation where you would like to do the same as this, and you only as far in the tech tree as I am here, you can build what I do. If you're further ahead in the tech tree, well, then you're going to have an easier time than I'm going to have. That is about it. So let's get ourselves into vehicle assembly and start talking about our build. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is put together a budget. And this one's not quite so easy because the Delta V maps aren't going to help us, because we're going for this sort of very specific orbit, and your orbit's going to be different than my orbit because these orbits are always different every time one of these contracts spawn. I do have math videos on how to do the calculations to actually calculate what the burns would have to be in order to get yourself from any orbit to any other orbit, and you can check those out if you are so inclined. But there's actually nothing wrong with simply taking something like just a probe core, that's all you need, and launching that, and then pressing Alt and F12 to bring up the console menu, going into the cheats part, setting an orbit, putting yourself into low orbit of Kerbin, just like that. And then from here, I can go into map view. So this is my orbit that I'm going for here. And I can simply say, okay, I want to make a burn to get out to where this apoapsis is. So all I got to do is put a maneuver and actually kind of set it all up. And then you can simply look here and say, oh, that's going to take me about 710 meters per second. And then if I'm going to circularize, well, put a maneuver out here and then set that one up. And this is, again, the first maneuver, but if I look at the numbers for the second maneuver, I can see that, oh, that's going to be around 270 meters per second, and you can do your budget this way. Let's revert back to the vehicle assembly building, and let me go over the budget that I came up with. So for the transfer out to that green orbit that you saw, I calculated my first burn to be about 720 meters per second. The second is going to be 270 meters per second, and that should satisfy the contract. Then I got to do the transfer out to the moon. Again, you can do the math, or if you want, you can do the same sort of thing you just saw me doing there, which is putting a probe core into orbit. I calculated that the transfer from that green orbit out to the moon is going to be about 280 meters per second to do the moon injection. And then the capture around the moon in the orbit that I want is about 130 meters per second. And then I'm going to add on about another, and this is very arbitrary, 300 meters per second, and this is just for flapping about. There's going to be some inclination changes and plane changes that are going to happen, so just an arbitrary 300s being added to that. And then finally, I like my orbital vessel to do the upper part of the orbital insertion when I launch from Kerbin during my ascent, and that's going to be about 1,000 meters per second. So if I add that up, I have a total delta V for the satellite of about 2,700 meters per second. And I accomplished that by first getting myself my Octo probe core, and then make sure to take a look at the contract. Let's get the right one. Remember, I do have two of these orbital ones. This is the one here where the orbit is about 3,600 kilometers by 1,500 kilometers. But notice that down here it says have a mystery goo unit aboard the satellite. Really easy to forget those kinds of things. So right off the bat, I'm going to grab that mystery goo so I don't have to worry about it. This isn't going to be where it's going to finally end up, but I just like to know that it is there. I'm also going to grab a Z200 battery. Now let's actually arrange this a little bit more like what I'm going to like. I'll put the battery there, and then I'm going to put the goo just on the battery on the side, like so. I don't have a whole lot of parts, as you saw with the tech tree, so what I'm going to do, I don't have any fairings unlocked yet, but I do have this service bay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to enclose this all in a service bay. We are also, for the relay, going to need some relay antennas, and at this time, the only relays antennas I have is the HG-5 high gain antenna, and I'm going to put on two of them. And again, I'm going to just stick them here for now, one on that side, one on that side. Two of them is really kind of what you need for an effective relay network. I have a whole video on calculating that kind of stuff if you're interested in that, or you can just take my word for it. But these are good. Two of these are good for around the moon or around Minmus. And we also need some electrical generation, so what we're going to do is use these Oxtat panels. I'm going to put on a total of 4 of them, and I'm actually going to tuck them inside this little service bay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that, I'm going to make sure the two-way symmetry is on and the snap is on. I'm going to rotate this on to the side, and then I'm going to grab the move tool. I'm going to take the snap off, and I'm going to drag this over to the side like that, so they're a little over halfway along, and you can see that the other one did the opposite move on this side. And then I'm going to grab another Oxtat panel, put the snap back on that way, there we go. Again, move tool, snap off, slide this one to the left and down, and the idea is that these two will provide our electrical generation for this once the doors are open. So you do have to be a little careful. You're getting no electrical generation at all with the doors closed, so make sure your doors are open and that the panels are pointing in an appropriate direction. Okay, so that's sort of the probe body part of it. Now we need to get some propellant under here. This is going to be a little bit on the ugly side, but I do have the FL-T100 fuel tank, and then under that's going to go the FL-T200 fuel tank, and then under all of that, well, again, my smallest engine is the LV909 Terrier engine, which quite frankly is a little bit on the big side for this. If I go over here and put this on vacuum, you can see I got plenty of delta V, but the thrust to weight ratio is kind of through the roof. I'll never burn it that kind of thrust to weight ratio, so I'm just going to bring the thrust to weight ratio down, I don't know, anything in the 1.49. That's fine. There's nothing critical about that. And finally, at the very top of all of this, I'm just going to put an aerodynamic nose cone. And after some texturing and the inclusion of some obligatory lights, it was time for the lifter. I'm going to continue to budget a generous 3,800 meters per second to get myself into low Kerbal orbit. And if I add that to the 1,700 meter per second mission budget, remember 1,000 meters per second of this probe is also for getting to orbit, that gets me a total budget for the rocket of 5,500 meters per second. And I accomplished that with the TD-12 decoupler, underneath which went 4 FL-T400 fuel tanks, and then underneath that entire stack went the LV-T45 swivel liquid fuel engine. I'm going with the swivel instead of the Reliant because I want the gimbling to help me out with attitude control. And if we take a look down here, that gets us a total delta V of 5,752, well over our budget. And if we take a look at the thrust to weight, and especially switch it over to sea level at this point, we have a thrust to weight ratio at launch of 1.30, a smidge on the low side maybe, but definitely adequate to get this thing off the ground, so it really doesn't need anything else. I think what I will put on, however, are just for stability, 4 basic tail fins, and then 4 of these launch stability enhancers. Remember, our first target is an orbit inclined at 16.9 degrees, and to facilitate that, I'm going to launch into a low parking orbit matching the plane of our target orbit. This is something I've talked about in detail in the past, but just to go over the basic ideas, you want to launch when the KSC is beneath either the ascending or descending node of the target orbit, and noting whether you need to launch to the north or south of due east. In this case, I need to launch to the south. Due east is 90 degrees, and 16.9 degrees south of that would be 106.9 degrees. But you want to set your heading a bit further south than that to pull the orbital prograde vector to the desired inclination. During the ascent, occasionally check how you're doing with inclination, adjusting accordingly. Reducing throttle during the upper part of the ascent gives you more time to make adjustments, making it, with a bit of practice, not that difficult to get quite close to the required inclination. Matching inclination minimizes the correction necessary to get to the target orbit. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the closer you are to the plane of the target orbit, the cheaper your transfer is going to be. As with inclined insertions, matching target orbits is also something I talked about in detail in the past, but to give some tips, when going for an elliptical orbit, it is most efficient to go for the apoapsis first, maximizing any benefit from the Oberth effect. This burn was followed by a small correction burn to get my apoapsis right on top of the target apoapsis. Finally, there is a third burn at apoapsis that combines prograde to raise the periapsis, normal to match inclination, and radial to rotate the periapsis and apoapsis to their necessary locations. All of this is only necessary because of the position a satellite contract. If you prefer, you can certainly take this relay build and just go straight to the moon with it, which would certainly be much more simple. Either way, after orienting the probe to make sure I have good exposure on the solar panels, it was time to get to the next phase of the mission. Alright, so now what we gotta do is we gotta get this from this orbit over to the moon's orbit. Ignore this purple one. That is going to be for next week when we go to do this with a second satellite. But it's a little bit tricky because we are in an inclined orbit, so not in the same inclination as the moon. We're in a bit of an equatorial orbit. So you kind of gonna play this by ear. And of course, you may end up being in a very different situation because your contract would have a different orbit than my contract does. But the first thing I would try is if you can manage to get an encounter either at the AN or the DN, that works out great because that will really save you from having to do any kind of, oh, look at that. Any kind of plane change. There's a lot of people that will say right away, oh, you got to get this plane of this orbit to match the moon's orbit. No, you don't. Almost never do you really have to do that. So you can see here I'm already getting a bit of an encounter without having to make the plane change. We'll make the appropriate plane change when we get to the moon. Don't worry about it. It's easier to do it there rather than to change this whole orbit. If it didn't quite work, I could move this around. The moon's a pretty big target. It's usually pretty easy to make it work. You can also, if it's not working on this particular pass, you can always just push ahead in orbit and see if you get it on the next path. You'll get it. Like, don't worry about that. If you really, really want to, make the plane change. I didn't budget for it, so I guess I'll have to say you're on your own if you do that. Alright, so we're going to focus our view on the moon. And now what we got to do is think about, well, what orbit do we want? When it comes to relays around the moon, I find a circular orbit at an altitude of 377.35 kilometers works really, really well. I have a math video where I called this the perfect orbit, and it's up here if you want to go take a look at it. The thing I really like about it is that it has a period of exactly 3 hours, and that, as you'll see next week, is really useful to have a period that is a very, very specific time, but also a time that's divisible by 3. That'll make way more sense next week. But right now, I'm going to go for that orbit. So I can see here that I need to bring this periapsis up. By the way, this doesn't have to be... I'm going to go for an equatorial orbit, but it doesn't have to be an equatorial orbit. Relays can be in any plane you want. But I am going to go for an equatorial orbit because I think that'll make it easier to rendezvous the next one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick this on maneuver. And instead of playing around with normal and all that kind of stuff, I'm first going to play around with time. So I'm going to push the time up to pretty high, 50 seconds. If I jump... Oh, that makes it worse. If I jump this way... Oh, that makes it a little better. What if I add a little prograde to this? And just sort of see if you can... what you can get away with just by playing with the timing before you get into fiddling around with normal. So right now, all I'm doing is adding a little bit of prograde and then a little bit of playing with the timing to try and get that. See how I brought that periapsis up closer. Now, I'm not saying I will never, ever use the normal. I might end up using the normal vector at some point. But it's nice to see what you can get away with just playing around without doing it, because the normal components can be expensive. Now, let's actually add a little bit of normal component to this. And whoops, that's a little bit too much. What I want to do, if you want to keep playing with the timing, that's fine, but I'm going to actually give up on that. I want this periapsis, if I put the moon's orbit on edge, play a little more with the timing too. Oh, look at that. That's lovely. Okay, might even bring this down a little bit. I want this periapsis right on, if you put the moon's orbit on edge, I want this periapsis right on that line. That's beautiful. And I want this to be 377.35 kilometers, as I've already said. So now you can see I'm actually getting pretty close. And you don't have to make this perfect. We'll tweak this later. But anything kind of in the ball, I'm stopping there. 377.447 kilometers. Beautiful. Okay, here it comes. Just gonna put this on here. And the main thing is actually less the distance to the moon, but more the position, the plane of where that periapsis is. I want it to be right on that line. And cut. That's more important than getting that distance, that periapsis distance right on. Okay, there we go. We're going to be there in about 4.5 hours. Alright, we have just entered into the moon's SOI. So now what I want to do is I want to get me into an equatorial orbit. Now, right now, what is my inclination? My inclination is 10.6 degrees, which honestly is not bad. It could have been a lot worse than that. But I want to get this periapsis to be exactly right. So the thing to notice is that I want it to be 377.35 and it's 335.348. The easiest way to fix this, you can make a node if you want to do this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my thrust limiter way down. I'm going to point this to the radially out vector, and then that will push this out that way. Okay. And it's just going to take my time, no rush, and just push it out till I see 377.35 kilometers. I got the thrust limiter way down. I'm hardly using any delta V for this bit. Alright, that's pretty darn close. And now what I want to do is get my capture, but I also would like to get my inclination down to 0. Again, if you don't want to do it, that's fine. Relays will work just fine without doing that. But I'm going to do it because I think it'll make it look nicer once I get the other satellites here. So, to do an inclination change, it's best to do it when you're moving as slow as possible. And actually, as we fall towards the moon, this is actually the point we'll be going as fast as possible. So this is not where we want to do the inclination change. What I'm going to do instead is leave myself in my apoapsis up fairly high, like that. And so we're going to come in, we'll get captured around the moon, but by the time we're up here, we're going to be moving very slowly. This is where we're going to make our inclination change. And there was nothing precise about this burn anyway. All I was interested in is leaving this apoapsis up really high. Okay, next step is I want to place a node out here. Now, where my orbit crosses the moon's equator, here is going to be my descending node, and out here somewhere is my ascending node. It's hard to know exactly where it is. You know, am I right over the equator? It's kind of hard to tell. So what we're going to do is I'm going to watch my inclination. I'm going to pull a bit on this normal vector, just like so. I'm going to see how low I can get this inclination. If I can get it to 0.0, then I am there. But if I can't, that means I'm not quite in the right spot. And again, how picky you want to be with this, like, right, oh, I did get it to 0. How picky you want to be is up to you. I had it at 0.1 degree there for a little bit, but I did get it down to 0, so that means I am pretty much in the right spot. If you can't get your inclination down to 0.0, that means that this is not quite at the ascending node, and what you got to do is just move it a little bit this way or that way. Just take a guess, see if you can get the inclination down further, or if you like, if you're not as pedantic as I am, what you can do is just not worry about that at all. But we're going to do this. Now, the other thing I do want to look at is I do want to look at my periapsis. Again, my periapsis changed because of that normal correction. So what I want to do is I want to reduce that periapsis back down to 377.35. Of course, that's going to also mess up my inclination. So it's going to take a little bit of flipping back and forth here. Boy, that's very good. Okay, excellent. So there we go. And what I'm really looking at is my inclination. I want to zero that out. I can fix my periapsis after that. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. There we go. Beautiful. What is my periapsis? 377.062, so I can tell I need to go a little bit prograde. And we're going to add just a little bit more energy to this. Again, we're looking for 377.35. Whoa, I gotta really turn down this. I did not expect that to be as thrust sensitive as that. So I'm turning the thrust limiter down to 0.5, which is as low as it goes. We're gonna have to flip around again because I overdid that. But way out here is the time to fix all this stuff. 0.3, that's good. Yep, not gonna touch that. That is wonderful. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to be doing our final burn down here at periapsis, and what we want to do is get our circular orbit 377.35 all the way around. Now I gotta be honest, it doesn't have to be perfectly that. What's the most important thing is that you get this period to be as close as you can to 3 hours. Now I'm noticing my periapsis of my predicted orbit is moving away, so that's telling me I'm not quite in the right spot. So I'm going to change my timing here a bit, bring those two periapsi right on top of each other, just like so. Bring this down. What I'm really looking at is that orbital period. I want that orbital period right here to be as close as I can. Let's turn this scale down to almost nothing. There it is, 3 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, okay? And again, what I'm really looking at is that orbital period right here. That's the thing that I really want to pay attention to more than anything else. I'd like that to be as close as I possibly can get it to 3 hours. And as we get under a minute here, we got 21 seconds to go. I'm going to once again put this at 0.5 to really get the absolute minimum throttle I can. 3, 2, 1, there. 3 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. You can see there's a slight difference in my apoapsis and periapsis. That doesn't really matter. My semi-major axis is actually what I want it to be, but the period is the more important thing. So, with this relay now inserted, let's go over the main takeaways from this episode. First, the position of satellite contracts are a great way to tack a contract onto this mission, though doing so is completely optional. As for inserting the moon relay, set your closest approach to the moon to be close to 377.35 kilometers. After capture, zeroing your inclination is optional, but if you are going to do it, do that correction far away from the moon to save fuel. And finally, when inserting into your final orbit, getting that orbital period as close as you can to 3 hours is what's most important. It's fine if your orbit is not perfectly circular. And with that, I'm drawing this episode to a close. Join me next week when I'll be inserting 2 more relays to join this one and looking at how to position them so that they are all equally spaced along this orbit. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you then.